You are listening to the Hiking Radio Network, where we talk the walk with shows by hikers about hikers for everybody.
Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Join Steve and his guests every week as he staggers from Georgia to Maine.
Thanks very much for coming back to Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, sponsored by our friends at Trailtopia. I think that we got a great episode today. We're up to episode number 78, and our guest is a truly remarkable bloke for a number of different reasons. You're going to find out more about Curt Ebert, but you may find an early clue in his trail name, which is Disciple. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but Curt's story kind of unfolds as he tells it, with new layers coming all the time. Curt, or Disciple, will be along soon. But first, it's lunchtime. How about those days when you've struggled through the morning, probably got 10 miles under your belt, and breakfast is a distant memory? It's lunchtime, and yep, you could always have your fourth Snickers of the day for yet another sugar rush. But sitting there in an empty shelter, protected from the bitter wind, I'm sure you'd really rather have Trailtopia's beef-flavoured ramen noodles with green beans, corn and mushrooms. Tea-flippin'-licious. And if you need to go without the gluten, all of Trailtopia's ramen noodle lunches and light dinners are available gluten-free. Try Trailtopia Adventure Food, the best of home cooking away from home. Also on this week, possibly for the last time, is Dr. Lynn Savino. What a joy it's been for me to speak regularly with this wonderful woman. She started out as a guest on the show when she shared some of her hiking adventures with us, but the two of us continued our conversation and we got onto the fact that she's a doctor. And as with pretty much everything I do in my life, we stumbled into DocSpot, with Lynn giving us medical insights that many of us, or certainly me, had no idea about. This last conversation is a direct result of our initial chat about the phenomenon of post-trail depression. We spoke about this a few weeks ago, maybe even a couple of months ago actually, and I tried to augment the show with a post on Facebook that invited ideas about this apparent reaction to ending a through hike, or even, as you'll hear, a section hike. Lynn and I collated the responses and have tried to come up with our own conclusions. Now, I'm obviously not a doctor, but it seems clear to me that there are a few ways to mitigate this thing, I guess. Lynn will be here after Curt and we'll share what we think about this subject with you. So, Curt. When I heard about Curt, he seemed to have quite a story just from what I saw on YouTube and one or two listeners writing in about him. You're going to hear, though, that I had only heard part of the story. Here is Curt Ebert. Okay, I'd like to introduce a hiker who has been requested that I interview him by some of our listeners. This is Curt Ebert, or Disciple. Hi, Curt. How are you?
Oh, hi, Steve. Good morning. I'm well, thanks.
Good. And I've actually subscribed to your YouTube site. I've seen several of your videos, and that begs a few more questions, but we'll come to some of those later. And I want to tell your story in layers because I think it's quite a remarkable story for a number of different reasons, which hopefully we're going to bring out as the conversation goes on. So I'd like to start really with what you were doing prior to hitting the trail last year, about a year ago now, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is, as you said, quite a story, and we do have a lot of videos up on our YouTube channel that kind of helps to tell this story. But before I got started hiking, actually for the past about 8 years, I've been a pastor.
Okay. And was that central to your spiritual life? Which it's not meant to be a stupid question. Is it something that was important to you? Is it something that was important to you at the time?
Oh, absolutely. Was being a pastor central to my spiritual life? I would say my spiritual life was central to me being a pastor or being in ministry. No one in my family had ever been in ministry, and so it was never anything that I sought to do. In fact, when I put my faith and trust in Jesus as Lord and Savior. It was some years later that then I feel like God called me into ministry, and I sort of went kicking and screaming. It wasn't anything that I aspired to do. However, being in the center of God's will is definitely the best place to be. So, I think my faith made me just obedient, and I was ready to do whatever He wanted. And for many years, it's been to be in ministry.
So it was a calling. And how long ago did that happen? You became a pastor?
I was ordained into the ministry in 2010. I preached around Illinois, where I'm from, for almost a year before that, kind of going around to different churches and filling in for pastors.
Well, your story of a pastor, I guess, is similar to a number of other people's, but then things changed somewhat. And so what happened one afternoon, and I believe you told me it was a Sunday afternoon, when you sat down with your wife, you came to a decision that had really many ramifications. Let's talk about what that was like and tell us the conversation from your standpoint.
Wow, we could spend a whole podcast just on this Sunday afternoon. What an afternoon. It definitely rocked our world for possibly forever. We're still not sure. But okay, it was February 26th, just over a year ago as we're recording this. Yeah. And as you're correct, my wife and I sat down one Sunday afternoon to do a Bible study together called The Insanity of Obedience. And it was week number 1. We sat down in our living room. It got quiet. We have 4 children, and they were all off in different places. And so we actually had some alone time, some quiet time to do our Bible study together. And as we sat in the living room, different pieces of furniture, we were kind of doing the Bible study together and alone at the same time, if that makes any sense. And during the Bible study, the first thing that we studied was from the book of Genesis chapter 12, where God called Abram, who later was known as Abraham, to go. And Abram didn't understand where he was going or how long he was going to be gone, but he did it. He said yes, and God sent him off to what would eventually be the promised land. And Abram was obedient even when it looked crazy and didn't make sense. And during that Bible study, it was as though the Lord Himself came and stood between us. And my wife and I, at the exact same time, again, several feet apart, realized that God was calling me to go out and to hike the Appalachian Trail.
Man, I mean, I knew that was coming, obviously, because this is I've tried to structure this in a way that tells a story, but at the same time, as people know and listen to this show, I'm not in the least bit faithful in terms of religion. So it fascinates me that this happened. So how did it actually manifest itself? What did you see? Did you feel? Or was it something that just clicked inside your head?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I wish I had just a clear, perfect answer that if you're wondering how God will speak to you, this is the way it will happen. And unfortunately, I don't have an exact answer like that for everyone. Yeah. But in my case, typically what happens is that God actually begins the calling process months, maybe even years before He then finalizes it. And what He does, in my case, at least with my wife and I, is He begins to stir a little bit of a desire for something. And He begins to even make preparations to where whatever He's calling us to do would not be a huge leap. It would be more of a gradual process that He's already begun working. So in our case, He'd already kind of started a desire to be more healthy, to go out and enjoy the wilderness more. Right. Yeah. And so we'd even had planned a vacation to the Smoky Mountains this last summer. And during that vacation, we were thinking of going out and spending some time on the Appalachian Trail. So
interesting.
That Sunday afternoon, as we sat there praying through our Bible study and listening to the first account of just radical obedience, in the Bible, the call that day, my wife and I both sensed, kind of in our heart, we sensed in our spirit that God, He kind of opened up our eyes to understand how He had been laying the groundwork for me to then go out and actually hike the trail.
Wow.
I believed at the time in its entirety. So long answer to your short question, he kind of opens up your eyes and understanding and gives you a burden in your heart to where you just sort of understand more clearly for the first time what it is he wants.
Right. So your kids are out that afternoon, or they're not with you and your wife in your Bible study. So you make the decision to go, and your kids come home. How did that go? I mean, really, what was that conversation like? And how old are they, by the way?
Yeah, well, we have 4. We have a daughter that is 19, and she's in college down in Tennessee. And then we have a boy who's now 15. He was 14 at the time.
Yeah.
We then have another girl that is now 8. She was 7 at the time. And then a boy that's 6. He was 5 at the time.
So what was their reaction?
Okay, well, as you can imagine, each one is at a different level of maturity. Our oldest is a very godly young woman. She's even going to a Southern Baptist college, like I said, in Tennessee. And the day of this calling, she had been to her own church down there by her college, and the preacher had preached a very similar message to the study that we were going through that Sunday afternoon. We had no idea what was going on in her mind, but God was actually kind of revealing to her name is Emily, revealing to Emily that we were supposed to go out and hike this trail. So he actually kind of laid the same burden on her heart as he did ours. So to her, it was absolutely no surprise. In fact, she was very supportive, not understanding how in the world it would ever happen, but knowing at the same time that if God was calling, he would make it happen. Our oldest boy was a little bit confused. He likes normalcy, and he was like, wow, but he definitely trusts his mom and dad and our spiritual discernment. The little ones were just excited. They just thought it was super cool. They're up for any adventure.
Now, you mentioned very at the beginning Abraham and how he just went, and this was your thought, you would just go. Did you give any thought, or did you consider at the time what the purpose might be, or was that irrelevant as far as you were concerned?
Oh, Steve, I'm definitely a planner and a preparer. I'm a researcher, and if I have my own way, I'll drag my feet for years to make a decision and getting all my ducks in a row and everything. So for me to do anything super spontaneous is not in my nature.
Right.
Yeah. So no, I definitely, as quickly as I could, all sorts of different thoughts and emotions are going through my mind. In fact, that afternoon.
I would think, yeah.
Oh yeah, especially as a parent. I mean, I take my parenthood and my role as a pastor in the local church very seriously. So for me to make a decision that would interrupt any of that is a big deal. Yeah. You bet.
But you just followed. So how did but actually, before I ask that question, I want to get another one. So what were the implications, I'm not so sure what the word is, the monetary or the financial or the stuff that goes around having a family? What were the implications for your family from that decision? The immediate implications. The immediate implications.
Yeah, very big implications, immediate. So first of all, as I was the only income provider for our family, and so for me to sense this calling, to say yes to the calling, would mean resigning my church. To hike the Appalachian Trail, as you well know, is about a 6-month proposition, and so nobody's going to wait around for 6 months, or very few churches would wait around or whatever for 6 months without a pastor. So I knew it was going to end up costing me my church, which then we were living in a parsonage, which would also cost us our home. So our occupation, our livelihood, and our housing were all hanging in the balance.
So where did you go? Did you have to move quickly? Was this something that once you made the decision, you had to move on?
Yeah, no, our church was extremely gracious. As you can imagine, there were lots of emotions, lots of different across the board. A church that has roughly nearly a couple hundred active members. There was lots of emotion from all sorts of different angles, but the church voted together to allow my family to stay at least a couple of months
good.
After I left, so that they could get things together, get ready to move, find a place to live, and then go. So we had no rush, no time constraint really. In fact, even help from some of the members, when we did go to move and things like that. So the church was very gracious.
That's good to hear. So you made the decision, you told your family. How do you tell the church? Did you just tell them as a congregation?
So what I chose to do, and this took a lot of prayer and discernment on my part, but I had pretty clear what I felt like direction on how I should handle this. And so I met with my deacons, my closest form of leadership. Sure. I met with them on Wednesday after the Sunday calling. Wow. I met with them on Wednesday evening, and I explained to them exactly what was going on, how I felt this calling, and they knew me closer than anyone. And so they trusted that if I felt like this was what God was saying, that boy, God was saying it. And so we just prayed together. We just talked, and I felt very clearly like the simplest thing for me to do would be to resign and not put the church in a position of voting whether I could go or not, or come back or not. And so we all felt clearly that was the best thing to do. So that next Sunday morning, so 1 week later, after my sermon, I made my sermon a little bit shorter that week, gave myself some time at the end. I just got back up and I explained, look, today's service isn't quite over. I have some news for you. And I went through a little bit of the calling. I announced my resignation and gave them 3 weeks notice. The bylaws called for 2 weeks, and I gave them 3 weeks notice.
So your congregation is listening. You can see their faces. How are they reacting when you're telling them this?
Oh, it was rough. 98% of the congregation absolutely just loved my family and I. There's always a few, that disagree. You can say that the sun is beautiful, and they'll say, well, no, it's not. There's always a few people like that, but overall, we were very well loved and appreciated by the church, and they were shocked. I had not expected to leave. I wasn't thinking of leaving. We were making plans for months in the future. So this came as a shock to me. It came as a huge shock to the congregation. People were very sad and crying. And I remember that day that I announced my resignation, people were lined up. I'll bet 30 or 40 minutes, just waiting in line to come up and hug me and my family and talk to me. And
that's nice.
It wasn't even our last Sunday, but they were just, it was a big deal.
Did you get any really real nastiness or any real anti feeling? Did they think you've gone crazy? Did anybody think you've gone crazy?
Well, that's two separate questions. And
yeah, you're right. Sorry about that.
The first one is no. We didn't get any nastiness. Again, most of the people connected to our church family or connected maybe through social media, just say distant friends, sure. They knew us well enough to know that if my wife and I felt like God was saying something, then they trusted us, that we have a very strong relationship with the Lord. So we didn't get any nastiness. What was the second part to your question?
Did they think you were crazy? Actually, don't even bother answering that, because just to give our audience, and I talked about building up the structure of this conversation, just to give our audience an idea that you actually are crazy, quite apart from being called by God thing. One last thing we're going to mention before we go into the hike itself. What is it about you, Curt, that makes the prospect of a through hike even more difficult?
Yeah, well, the fact that I am legally blind would make it a lot more difficult.
You think? Man,
yes, sir.
Yes, that blew me away. That really blew me away when I heard that. That is extraordinary. That's extraordinary. So let's talk about that then. Well, not necessarily the blindness, but yes, talk about it in the context of hiking. How easy is it for you to hike on a flat trail? I know you can see light, can't you? You can see things and you see outlines. How on earth do you cope with rocks and, or particularly roots on the trail?
Yeah, the challenges of the trail. Well, I believe, so I mean, yes, people thought I was absolutely crazy, and many of our closest friends and family were very worried about my safety. Like, how in the world are you going to do this? And it's our faith that allowed myself and my wife. I talk about us because my wife and I are just, very, very close, and we're best friends. And
Sure.
so we were just confident that if God was calling me to do it, that he would get me through it. And if it's funny, Steve, if you talk with some of my closest hiking, buddies and partners on the trail, when they would meet with my wife, then like later on, and they would just shake their heads and say, I can't believe what that guy can do. Because if you see him like in town or trying to look at the guidebook or whatever, I can't see much. I'm very, very, impaired visually, but man, God would take my feet and put them right where they needed to be, and I could scoot on down the trail. So
I was going to ask
how
you
did I cope with it?
Yes.
I just hiked.
I was going to ask you, did you feel, maybe you always feel God's presence, and that's must be wonderful for you. Did you feel him guiding you? Did you feel him saving you several times from falling, or did you fall quite regularly like I did?
So, of course, like I think nearly every single hiker, I crashed multiple times. There was a couple of doozies and a couple of just slips where I gracefully went down to the ground. But did I like physically feel God like moving me along? No, sir, I didn't. But looking back at a section I just hiked or back at the day, the only answer to how I could do it is God's hand upon my hike in general. The only way to make it to Maine for me with my visual impairment, is God. God did it.
Well, so he wanted you to go, and you went. Had you hiked much previously, or was this a new thing for you? You said you were planning on going in the Smokies and so on. Was hiking in your DNA?
It was not. Had we hiked? Yes. My wife has always liked to hike a lot more than me. In fact, I didn't even like walking that much. I would run. I would ride a bike. I love to paddle canoes, but walking and hiking, not so much. No, I was not a big hiker at all. In fact, in Illinois, there's very few places to backpack overnight, hike, but we would do little day hikes and things around local state parks, but that's about it.
So how did you accumulate your gear and do your training if you weren't a hiker? And did you get to take advice from people? Did you read it up, or did you just intuit things?
Yeah, a little bit of all the above. So we love YouTube. We're YouTube junkies. My whole family, we love to watch other people's through hikes, and you can gain lots of wisdom from watching what worked for them and what didn't. I especially love post-hike gear reviews because you can see what they finished with. Yeah. And that's what I tried to start with, was what other people finished with, because at the beginning of a hike, most people have very little experience, and so I don't really care what they think they're going to use. I want to know what they did use. So I did a lot of research on YouTube. We love to canoe camp, and so we already had lots of camping gear, mostly heavier than what you need. So as we had said, we were planning on doing hopefully as much as a week in the Smoky Mountains on our summer vacation. So we had accumulated trying to go with more lightweight gear. We'd already accumulated some of the stuff. So when the call came from the Lord, it wasn't a huge jump to finish up getting some of the last pieces of gear that I needed. And we had more faith to go ahead and spend the money to do it, I guess, at that point.
Extraordinary. So your wife accompanied you for the first 200 miles. Was it always the plan that she would do the first part only? And how tough was it to separate after that time together on the trail?
Right. So she actually ended up doing about 50 miles with me. We parked our car in Unicoi Gap. Because of my vision, I don't drive. Haven't driven in a long, long time. Cool, so she always, drives with me. So I needed a ride to the trail. It's a long hitch from Illinois down to Springer Mountain, Georgia. So I hitched with her. She gave me a ride down there. But she would love to do the whole trail with me, but somebody had to be responsible and take care of these rugrats that the Lord gave us And so she did the first 50 miles with me. Again, we
50.
parked our car at Unicoi Gap near Hiawassee, Georgia, got a shuttle to Springer Mountain, and then we hiked back to Unicoi Gap. And how hard was it to separate it? It was brutal. Again, my wife is the love of my life and my best friend, and so it was very hard to see her go. But the Lord allowed my family to come out and to join me and see me multiple times. I think 5 times along the trail, including my wife finished up the 100-mile wilderness with me. She did the entire 100-mile wilderness, finished up the trail with me. So it was hard each time they had to leave.
I'm sure it was. And was it always clear to both of you that you were the one chosen to do the hike, not her? Or did you feel at some stage it was the two of you, or was it ever just her? Or, I mean, how did that work out?
Oh, wow. Great. Another great question. So yes, she reluctantly knew that the hiking itself was for me, for good or bad, or for whatever reason, we both knew that it was for me. But however, the calling was definitely for both of us. In fact, it was for our whole family, because as you know, from hiking the trail, it's not a lone adventure. You need lots of support, especially me with my low vision. Grocery shopping was nearly impossible. So my wife was heavily involved. In fact, there's no way I could have done it without her support, getting resupply boxes together and even helping me moment by moment with navigation at times. If I had cell phone service, I would call her and she would look up, even watching people's YouTube videos while we were on the phone together, to say, oh yeah, up here at this road junction, you're going to go left or east or whatever, and go a quarter mile down the road. So she wanted to hike with me, but she was instrumental even at home when she was at home, with all the support.
I'm sure you're aware that this is the thing. It's so much easier to do as almost part of a team. You happen to be the one selected to do the hiking, but she was certainly the support. So that, you do it as a couple anyway, don't you really? And when you were on the trail, did you, and funnily enough, this is probably easier in America than it would be, say, in the UK or Europe, because we are very UK particularly is a very secular country, but America isn't. So on the trail, did you initiate expressions of your faith, or did you allow conversations to develop? And was that your faith ever an issue to some of the people you met on the trail?
Yeah. So my strategy, I feel like Christians, and I use that word reluctantly because I think in America we've gotten to the point where we don't really know what the definition of Christian means. It's way deeper than believing in God or believing that Jesus is the Savior and died on the cross for our sins. So to me, Christian means little Christ, which means a follower of Jesus, modeling our life after the perfect one, that was able to die for our sins. So all that to say, I feel like Christians have done a little bit of a disservice in the past at times with, quote, like beating people over the head with their religion or with the Bible or whatever. And so I'm very cautious about how I come across with people. And I tried my best to go out on the trail and live as a follower of Jesus and allow my faith to hopefully impact other people in as minute or magnificent of a way as possible. So I tried to just live as a follower and allow conversations to develop. My trail name is Disciple.
Yes, there was a bit of a clue there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, follower of Jesus. And it was rarely a day would go by when I wouldn't get the opportunity to explain to someone why my name is Disciple. And sometimes it would end at that. And sometimes it would mean hiking together with a person even for days as they asked questions and wanted to know more. And as to the question of did my faith ever seem like offensive to anyone, as far as I know, no. Now, what was said like later on after I hiked on or as people hiked on, I do not know. But as far as I know, I think that most people really, really enjoyed my company and didn't seem to be an issue.
I get the impression you put out a good nature, you put out a good person. And so if you're living as good a life as you can possibly be, that isn't proselytizing. Proselytizing is when you try to ram it down people's throats, and people tend not to like that sort of thing, as far as I'm concerned anyway.
Yes,
See,
sir.
I find this, as you know, we've spoken before. We had a very long conversation, just so the listeners know. Curt and I had a long conversation before, and I was fascinated by all of this, as you can imagine, because I'm a very intellectually curious person, and this is something that was just alien to me, and I just thoroughly enjoyed speaking with him, and I thought, the audience would love to hear this as well. Now,
I wish
I know
we recorded that conversation, because you said, wow, I lost count of how many times. It was a great conversation.
I did say wow a lot, I must admit. Now, but I've still since thought of other things I wanted to know. And one of the things and I got this from looking through your videos, because you did this video log, which was great. And as you know, there are amazing views, stunning views every single day on the trail, if the weather's decent anyway. Can I presume that you didn't really see much of them at the time? And if that is so, are you seeing them now for the first time through your own videos? Can you see them in your videos?
Yeah, that's another great question, and it's really hard to describe what I can or cannot see.
Okay.
And so I know when I got to views, to those scenic overlooks where everybody gathers and grabs a Snickers bar and and drinks some water and sit down and just enjoy God's creation together. I know I couldn't see the same detail that other people would see, but I know looking at a sunrise or a sunset, it's not, you don't have to see every detail to know that it's gorgeous, to know that it's beautiful. And so sitting there, other people might be able to see more definition, or even mountain ranges like layers deeper than I could, but I could still just sit and be in awe at the glory of God's creation. And then now, watching videos, I'll stand up and get up right up next to the television and even pause it and look, and I can see more detail.
That's what I was thinking.
At times I would zoom in. So yeah, it's great to watch the video. The vlog
is fascinating.
was wonderful. I can go back and relive everything. It was a little bit of a chore doing it, but now it's such a blessing.
I'm sure. I mean, that's the thing that struck me looking at these videos, thinking, he couldn't have seen that when he was doing it, but now he can. And I think that's a wonderful thing for you to have, I must say.
Yeah, the joy of modern technology.
Now, you met a bunch of people on the trail, and they scan an entire range, don't they? And the rating can be 1 to 10, good or bad. You choose whichever spec and they want to be on. But there's a somewhat boisterous nature for one or two of your fellow hikers. How did you adapt to that kind of feral lifestyle and the kind of loose lifestyle that people really enjoy living on the trail? And I certainly don't knock it. How did you adapt to it?
Right. I agree, like with what you said. I certainly don't knock it. And one of the things I've learned as a man of faith, as a follower of Jesus, again, is that I think so many church people have done such a disservice to the unchurched world out there by adopting a little bit of, say, a holier than thou attitude, or I know more than you do because I believe in God and the Bible and all of that stuff. And so again, my lifestyle is to try to be in this world and impact this world for good, for the glory of God. And so, yes, boy, you're right. Especially near the beginning of the trail, there are some boisterous characters out there. And I think people get together and even act more boisterous than they would if they were, alone or whatever. And so I'll admit it was a little bit challenging at times to go to a shelter where there may be a group of, partiers together that are kind of being rambunctious. But I tried to just be myself and try to love on them as much as possible. And I believe, again, I had a good relationship with nearly everyone, hopefully everyone on the trail. And after Damascus, Virginia, that crowd really thinned out. And so after then, people getting 500 or more miles under their shoes, the people that are out there to hike stayed, the people that are out there to party kind of left. And so it got easier as we went on. But again, I tried to just be around whoever God put me in front of and live for the Lord, whatever that meant.
Well, I looked at your YouTube page, and you've got such positive comments on there that generally I think people were very, very supportive of you. So I think that should tell people what they need to know about, how people saw you on the trail as well.
Yes, sir.
Now, I would, we had, once again, this was part of our conversation the other day, but I think I know the answer anyway. consider the scenario of being in Baxter State Park. And I want listeners to think about this themselves, whatever their faith. It's 6 a.m. on your ascent day and you get excited to go. And suddenly you get another calling from God to, I don't know, go and do good works in Guatemala. And he wants you to go right then.
Oh, boy.
Would you go right then? Or would you climb Katahdin first and then go to Guatemala?
So I've hiked 2,100 and roughly 85 miles at that point. I'm staring up at the Baxter Peak in Baxter State Park. And would I finish the trail? So I've thought about that question since you posed it per our first conversation. And here's how I might answer that. I would like to think I could maybe argue with God to the point that I was able to go up to the top and finish the trail and then say, oh, you want me to go now? Oh, okay, I'll do it. And then I climb back down and go to Guatemala or wherever he's calling me. But here's the truth.
That is a better answer than the one you gave me before.
Right. Here's the truth. That's my funny answer. And, but here's the honest to goodness truth. As much as I would absolutely hate to think about not, getting to finish it. If I felt like down at the campground at the base, if God was calling me to Guatemala, I would turn, hitch a ride to Millinocket, catch a train, whatever I had to do, because I just feel like if God was calling me to go now, I would do it. And he had a purpose.
That's awesome.
And that would mean not summiting Katahdin, but maybe on a vacation later, I'd come back and do it.
Quite right, too. I'll tell you, that is an amazing thing. I admire, I don't have it myself, but I absolutely admire somebody who has the faith to feel that way. Mm. But God didn't call you that morning. He was going to let you go up the top.
That's right.
You go up the really tough climb, isn't it? But you're fit for it by then. You've done all those 2,185 miles already. And you get to the top and you suddenly see the sign and you walk towards it and finally you touch the sign and it's all over. What was your primary emotion? Was it towards God? Was it towards your family? Was it towards your hike? What was your first emotion when you touched that sign?
Our summit day was a little bit different than most thru hikers because my family was able to come out into Maine and meet me there and join me. Our oldest daughter, Emily, left college, surprised me. She got a flight into Bangor at like midnight the night before our summit date. And so her and then our oldest son, Gabe, surprised me there at the campground that morning. My wife had known about it, so she was stalling me. I'm trying to get going, like we got to get up there. All I wanted to do was finish the trail, touch that sign, take some pictures, and go back down to town and get a big steak dinner. That's what I wanted to do. And my mom and dad come pulling into the campground. It's still dark. They brought our oldest children out to surprise me. And so my summit day was different than most thru hikers in that our oldest son, Gabe, had not done much hiking at all. And so I had to like help him, get to the summit. And then, that's only halfway. Now you have to get back down.
That's tough for somebody who hasn't done it at all. Man.
Exactly. What a climb. In fact, I do not recommend, the Appalachian Trail ascent or descent of Mount Katahdin. That was difficult. But anyway, so when I got to the sign, it was like relief that I had been allowed to get there because of having like a little bit extra burden of kind of making sure my family got up there safely also. And then now a little bit of the struggle, okay, how are we going to get back down? And it was getting late in the day, and all my fellow thru hikers had already summited and were gone. There were only two other thru hikers that I knew at the sign when I got there. But it was still a marvelous, marvelous time. And it was such a relief to know, because I was worried physically that I might like slip and fall and hurt myself even up until the last tiny bit. So what a relief. I definitely was glorifying the Lord and thanking my family and everyone that was responsible for helping me to get to that point. So what a relief and what a joy. And if you watch my summiting Katahdin video, you can see the climb and see my emotion. And our oldest daughter sings the song.
I saw that.
That's our oldest daughter singing that song at the very end. So that's very emotional.
Right.
I can't watch it without tearing up. what an amazing end to an amazing
Well,
journey.
Absolutely. And what's happened in your life after the trail? And did you learn stuff about yourself that you hadn't previously been aware of?
Yeah, I definitely learned that I had no idea what our bodies were physically capable of. Like, we can do way more than we give ourselves credit. And even our oldest son, Gabe, what he was able to do that final day with me, to climb that mountain and then ascend it and make it, was remarkable. So I learned that we're a lot tougher than we give ourselves credit. We can do a lot more.
Sure.
And as far as the answer to what's happening now, since I returned from the trail, first of all, I had to recover physically. By the time you finish Maine, you're beat down. Your body's pretty well depleted. And so I had to do some physical recovery, but also reconnect with family and friends. But then the Lord's opened up lots of doors, opportunities for me to go around and speak about my journey, my walk of faith. And so I've been very busy going around and speaking at all sorts of places, from youth groups to men's wild game dinners to lots of churches, places like that, and talking about my journey and talking about faith.
That is wonderful. I'm sure that's a really interesting conversation. Because I've been drawn into this conversation myself, and we've gone on much longer than we normally do. But this is so good. There's a couple more questions I still want to ask you. Do you ever either pray to God for the answer, or simply just sit and wonder what the purpose of you doing the Appalachian Trail was? And if you have, what do you think it was?
You ask some really good questions for a man that, by your admission, like is not a man of faith. You certainly.
I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated that a man can subjugate his own desires to put them in the faith of something or somebody else, or power higher than himself. And I find that a fascinating thing that anybody can do. I don't knock it. I would never try to say this is nonsense. I just think this is such an amazing thing that you've done, that I wonder whether you ever wonder what that purpose is, or if it matters to you what the purpose is.
Wow. Again, such a good question for someone that says you don't get it, but I think you understand a lot more than what you let on. But anyway, to answer your question,
I'm not as dumb as I look. I'm not as dumb as I look, I tell you.
I'm not even going to touch that one. All right. To answer your question, I certainly have spent time, and as you walk, you've got on average 10 hours a day of hiking. So lots of time to spend with the Lord in prayer. I got to read through the Bible at least twice. I read lots of books, more than that, of the Bible. And I read lots of audiobooks also, but I got to spend a lot of time in prayer. And to be honest, this may sound crazy to you, but the reason for the hike doesn't matter to me. If God called me to do it, the fact is you have to do it. There's no, if you surrender your life over to Jesus as Lord and Savior, you have to do whatever he says, whether you like it, whether you agree with it, whether you understand it or not, you have to do it. That's what surrender means. And I believe if you're retaining control of your life, you haven't surrendered to him, and he may not then be your actual Lord and Savior. So the answer to why did I have to do this hike doesn't actually matter to me. I just knew I had to do it. But I do believe, and it was primarily through our YouTube channel, that I've been able to see how God has used this legally blind guy, leaving everything that seemed normal and good and comfortable behind, and going out and hiking 2,000, nearly 200 miles, has woken up the church. That's churches all across the world and denominations all across the world to the need for radical obedience as being normal, not something extraordinary. And I've gotten messages after messages from people, again, all over the world, saying, you've inspired me to now do what I feel like God is calling me to do. And so I think not only just the presence of Jesus on the trail and day-to-day witnessing for the Lord, but also awakening the need for faith and obedience all over is part of the reason for this hike. But I also, Steve, I don't think it's done. I think he's still using this hike for his purpose and his glory, and I just can't wait to see what he's going to do next.
Well, I tell you what, I get emails every week over every episode that I do. I'm sure I'm going to get emails about this, and you may very well find, I may very well find that this is an inspiration to a number of people to adopt a similar attitude. So, it's not an attitude to you, it's a faith, and that's an entirely different thing. But you know what I mean? People will listen to this and think, yes, I understand that. Last question. When we spoke before, you told me that you saw yourself as a hiker through the prism of Jesus. And I kind of understand that. But going forward, are you going to hike of your own volition, or is now pretty much every move you make based upon what the Lord calls you to do?
Yeah, another fantastic question, and I think that God definitely has a plan and a purpose for everyone. And the question is, are we going to surrender and be obedient and do it, or are we going to retain control of our lives ourselves? And so I think that obviously from my whole story, that being obedient and doing what you feel like the Lord is telling you to do is crucial. But at the same time, I don't think he cares whether I go out and hike the Illinois River Bluff Trail for a day or a weekend, or the Ozark Trail for a few days, or through hikes. That what he's, at least in my own life, is leading me to is life decisions. And so I would like to think, I guess the long answer to your short question is, I'll do whatever I feel like I would like to do, what would be beneficial for our family, until I feel like God is leading me to another major decision, and then I will do that, whatever that may be. So I think a little bit of both, maybe, to answer your question.
Well, I tell you what, as I did last time, I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you, and I really appreciate the time you've taken to give us really thoughtful answers to these questions, because they are, as I said, I'm an intellectually curious person, so to listen to you speak about this is an eye-opener for me, and I really appreciate the time you've given us. So thanks very much indeed.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a joy to talk with you twice now, and you're a fabulous podcast host, and it's just a privilege for me to be able to be on your show.
I appreciate it, man. Thanks so much, and hopefully we'll speak again sometime.
Yes, sir. Anytime. Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye. Now, wasn't that something? The guy didn't even particularly like walking. Yet, when he got the call, he didn't question it. He didn't ignore it, as I think many people would have done. He simply put in motion what he needed to do to carry out what he'd been told. Now, as many of you know, I am not a man of faith at all, but I can certainly, admire that adherence to a faith that motivated him to do something he'd never fully considered. Yeah, he'd been around the AT and they'd done a bit of hiking as a family, but to hear a call one afternoon with your wife, well, that takes a lot of faith to follow through with it. I hope that you thought I was appropriately respectful. I really tried to listen to his story and give him the time to tell it the way in which he wanted it told. I'll tell you what, though, if I was religious, I would want that guy as my pastor. I hope that you enjoyed hearing from Curt as much as I did. We had a couple of more great reviews this week. Humber DQ says that he likes that folks are just regular people and not portrayed as super hikers. He goes on that we do a good job in discussing the issues of leaving family and what it takes to do that. You're right, Humber DQ. It ain't easy for anybody to leave somebody you love at home. C-Trav says that she or he discovered the podcast recently and since then has become infatuated with the AT. Yep, C-Trev, that's kind of what happens. So now, for the last time on the show, it's goodbye to Dr. Lynn. Sadly, this one is about depression. Here is Lynn. And now, for the last time, unfortunately, unless you can find a few more diseases to frighten us with, we're back on with Dr. Lynn. Hi, Lynn. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm getting excited for this year's hiking season, starting to ramp up my training and my gear and my wish list.
Nice. When are you going out then? When are you going to go out next?
The snow has got to clear up a little bit before I really make some serious effort. Do a little bit here and there, a couple of miles in my local town. when am I really going to go out next? It might actually, believe it or not, be tomorrow.
Oh, nice.
If the weather holds up. So we had 4 days of rain here, and the snow melted. And if I get all my work done, I'm going to really try to do quite a number of miles on one of the local trails.
Nice, very nice. Well, look, we said we'd circle back. We did talk about what post-trail depression might be, or what we thought it might be. And I put a post up on the Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail Facebook page, and a number of people responded, and some really interesting things. I just want to read a couple of highlights of one or two things that were said. I'm not going to name the person's last name, but I'll say their first name. I'll just say a couple of things. David says that post-trail depression is very real. He said, 3 days after I summited Katahdin in jubilation and triumph, I found myself lying in bed staring at the ceiling amid a sea of tooting horns, wailing sirens and shouting voices. The city to which I returned was crowded, filthy, and full of people in a great big hurry without a second to say hello. And I thought that was interesting, didn't you? He felt disconnected because he was in a large city as opposed to the quiet of the woods.
Yes, that's a very common thread that we see as professionals, medical professionals, when people have anxiety or depression or something along those lines. When they are quieted, when they go out in nature, it just tends to quiet their emotions down. If they're often in a city with a lot of activity going on, it tends to be very distracting and unnerving. I'm not sure if I mentioned this once before, but there was an interesting study that was done. If people went for a walk in a city, doing city blocks, going for a walk versus going for a walk in a city park versus going for a walk in nature, and they talked about how they felt, but also they did things like blood pressure and heart rate and that type of thing. And there was a significant difference, even though it was the same number of miles. It was the distraction. You had to watch for cars and trucks, as opposed to just putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, just distractions. I mean, they're there all the time. It was interesting to me also that David said it was crowded. It was filthy, rather. Well, the trail's fairly filthy as well, but it's as if the filthiness of the city was a different filthiness, and I understand that. And the other.
It's a natural kind of dirt.
That's right. That's exactly it. Now, the next one was clay, and I think people know who clay is, but the reason I wanted a couple of words he said I wanted to highlight, one was he said, my wife said it was like living with a friendly but lost pig. when he finished his hike. How about that? It was like living with a friendly but lost pig. And he said that just the other day, I did a quick 5-mile snow hike in Colorado with one of his best friends from the AT in 2016. And he said that we always ask one another, do you still think about it? And the answer for both of us is every day. And it really is for me. I never go, well, obviously I'm doing the podcast and books and stuff, but I never go a day without thinking about the trail and thinking about it positively as well. It's almost as if I just can't let it go.
Yep. I mean, me too. Even though I just day hiked the Connecticut Appalachian Trail this summer, that is burned in my memory, and I will relive, the good parts, the bad parts, the horrible day when I thought I was having a heart attack, and the wonderful day when I, finally finished, and nobody was around for me to, tell. It's all those wonderful things, even for day hikers, same thing.
Yeah. Well, another guy, Stephen, said, I'm going to read pretty much his whole paragraph. It was a very real thing for me also. I was fortunate to through hike with my wife, so at least I had someone to talk to. And I think that does help, by the way. When we go back to Atlanta, I felt a major loss. I focused on getting a job where we could enjoy the outdoors. The search really helped me focus on something different and to have a new adventure. That led us to Colorado and now Montana. For quite some time, though, I remember being very negative about society. And I think this is something we did talk about before. Immediately getting on to doing something else, focusing on something new immediately is really important, isn't it?
It is. But I think it's also important for people to realize that as wonderful and as difficult and as terrifying and enlightening as the trail was, it wasn't all fun and games, and neither is real life. And
No.
you have to know that there are going to be, even if you say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to go find a job that allows me to be part of the outdoors. Wonderful, wonderful idea. But getting to that point, you're going to have some really wonderful days of great interviews and good feedback, and you're going to have days where you think you really nailed it, and they call you and say, sorry. So that's what life is. Life is a series of, disappointments and then happiness. And you have to remember that it's okay to be disappointed. It's okay to be depressed, because maybe, just maybe, it will stimulate you to say, okay, I got to get out of this funk.
Yeah. Yes.
I have to go do something. The problem becomes where you go into this depression where then you are immobile. You can't physically, mentally, emotionally move forward. And that's a real issue, and that's where you do need somebody somehow to help you out, either a friend or a therapist or, who knows, another hike. But people need to know that it's okay to be down and it's okay to be frustrated, because that's just the way life is.
Yeah, well, I definitely got into a funk when I got back, and for about 3 months, maybe 4 months, even 5 months, and it wasn't until I started writing about it that I really felt, not released from it, but that I really felt that I could cope with what was going on with me. I kept saying to my wife, I'm just achieving nothing. I'm getting nowhere. And I kept an accountability sort of spreadsheet with myself when I was writing, so I knew how much I had to write each week, and I pretty much kept to that. So needing to do something else to shake yourself out of it, I think was a good thing. And the next person was Crystal, and she just asked a question, really. She said, it appears to be a real thing. I wonder how much of it might be due to a decrease in exercise-induced endorphins.
Oh, I absolutely firmly believe that. Yes, I'm sure that there's a change. There's a change in a lot of what the body is physiologically experiencing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that has a lot to do with it. No question.
Well, funnily enough, and that leads me to the last one, which was a really, really long post, but really interesting post from a guy called Blaze, who's actually out there right now, I think, or he's just soon to start. And he says he's a rural family physician, and he's actually starting the AT in 75 days when he wrote this. So he's probably not out there yet. And so a couple of things I highlighted from what he wrote. He said, I wonder how much post-trail depression actually arises from unresolved stresses encountered before the trail. And I know that a lot of people I met were there to shake something off of their life and to try to find something new to bring some meaning to their life, as if they went out there expecting something to be resolved from the trail itself, which I don't think ever will. Do you?
That's a very interesting question. I often wonder, I'd love to put side by side, honestly, younger people. I know I'm sounding like an old woman now. Younger people who go out there expecting something or trying to, I don't want to use the word run away, but trying to figure out something that they're trying to either escape or acknowledge or understand what I'm saying, versus an older person in their 50s, 60s, 70s who's gone through life and has had life experiences, not all of which are good. We have as you get older, you and I both know we've had real ups and downs, real life gut-wrenching problems. And is there now more of a realization as you get older that, this is not so hard, I've done harder, or the finish is okay, not so bad, I've accomplished this, but look, I've accomplished harder things, not necessarily physically, but I've accomplished harder things in my life. And I know that maybe they can also say, I know that there's going to be something else, because there always was in the past. I just
that's
have to
true.
figure it out. Whereas people who are just starting out in their teens and 20s haven't had to live their life yet and haven't
Yes.
had those real highs and lows.
Yes.
So this is maybe their biggest high and then low that they're experiencing, and that will help them go through the rest of their life even better.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm going to read through a little bit more of what Blaze said, because he's going to be out on the trail soon. And he just finished by saying, this post is just my opinion. And he said he expects to get flack for it, for saying what he said. But, I think it's going to be interesting to me when he finishes. I wonder what his attitude is, or if he's changed his view on that. And he says, I always tell my patients that 3 things have been scientifically shown to help depression: counseling, exercise, and medication. And then a great line: everyone needs skills, but only some people need pills, which I thought was a pretty neat line.
That's a classic line in the practice of medicine, and it's not just for depression. I'm an internist, so I treat a lot of people with things like hypertension and diabetes and obesity and cholesterol. And the foundation of treatment is lifestyle management.
Right.
And if that doesn't work or doesn't get you to goal, then and only then do we add pills. And it's amazing how some people will really, really reverse their progress of disease with changing the way they eat and they work and they sleep and they exercise. It's so heartwarming. It really is.
One of the things that certainly has come up in a number of things I saw on this post was, he said, and Blaze says this as well, resuming an active lifestyle can help. And I'm sure that's true as well. Just getting back into some exercise. I know that I always feel better when I've done some exercise. I haven't been able to do it so much recently because of this pulmonary embolism, which I've still got apparently. But so I've been putting on weight, but I know when I've gone I did one cycle recently and I felt so great afterwards. I really did. So that helped.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing he said, which I thought was interesting, he says here, I've been impressed at how veterans, both military and trail related, often love to reconnect with each other to relive their experiences. Perhaps even this podcast can be therapeutic for former travelers and hopefully provide some hints for aspiring through hikers. That's interesting that, he's seeing perhaps, and obviously vets talk to each other, but people on this trail, I know I get emails regularly how they've learned a lot, particularly from you, actually, Lynn. They often say, thanks to Dr. Lynn for giving us some advice on this stuff. So perhaps just this group feeling of talking about stuff really helps people address it in some way. What do you think?
Oh, I think that's absolutely. It's group therapy without the price tag. I can only imagine. I'm sure you've had this too. People are coming into a shelter and they're setting up for the evening and sitting around a campfire, and I'm sure there's been many a deep conversation with people you have no clue about. You've met for the first time, and you just open up because you can, and the trail affords that. This is maybe another way where the trail provides. It provides free therapy. Well, of course, you got to walk a ways in order to do it, but it really can be very, very gratifying to be able to sit there and talk to somebody who can say, I get what you're saying. They may not have any answers, but at least they get it. And it's nice to be able to connect with somebody who has similar feelings.
Yeah, and the last one I will mention is Julie, who actually was no, I'm not so sure, but Julie said that post-trail depression is a very real thing for me as well. And she's a lady who's hiked the trail in sections. She says, I think one thing that helped each year of my section hike was planning the next section. Now that my section hike of the AT is complete, I do find myself at a loss of what to plan next. That's kind of, you've achieved your goal, you're done. That planning, you don't need to do anymore because you finished it. And I think that really we've all found this when we've got off the trail. If we allow ourselves to slip into a funk, or it overtakes us, getting on and doing something else is probably as good a thing as you can do as anything, isn't it, to get out of it?
It is. You remind me of a greeting card that one of my colleagues has on her desk of this wonderful little black lab with the biggest, happiest smile, his tongue hanging out. He just got out of the ocean, and he's shaking himself off on the beach. And the quote is, "Well, that was fun. What's next?"
Dogs do that all the time, though, don't they? Whatever they do, they're ready for something else, aren't they?
Right. So that's what you got to do. And I don't know if you remember the very, very first podcast that you and I did when I talked about the difference between day hikers and through hikers.
Yes.
One of my thoughts was, hiker midnight for the day hiker is coming home, having a shower, having a steak dinner, and then planning the next hike because you just got to get back out there.
Yeah. Well, look, we've tried to raise it. I don't know whether we know what the answer is. I do know that when you get off the trail, though, whatever your circumstances, you need to think about what you're going to do next. Try not to come back with no plan B, because there's a thing that happens to you that you could slip further down the path of being depressed. And I think you've just said this. That's the answer, Lynn, just to get back out there and do it again.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Or do something else. What's your next trail? What's going to be next? That was fun. What's next?
Exactly. What's next indeed. Now, I've already said goodbye to you on a previous episode because we thought that was going to be last, but I'm going to say goodbye to you again because this is the last illness or injury or anything like that we think we can discuss. If anything else comes up that you think is related to hiking, we would love to have you on the show again, Lynn.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I'm always interested to hear what everybody else has to say. We can revisit anything if people have any thoughts or ideas or neat tricks.
Yeah,
and I hope to see everybody on the trail, and happy hiking.
Happy hiking to you as well, Lynn. See you then.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you thought that was worthwhile exercise. To me, from what I've read and from what I've heard from other hikers, it's all about what's next when you finish your hike. Having no goal or even no plan B can seriously impair your after-hike time from what I can see. And it seems continuing at least a modicum of exercise might also help a bit. I'd love to hear what you all think. So email me at steve@mightyblueontheat.com if you have any insights that may have worked for you. Next week, we've got another great story with Maria Wishart, or Wheezy P. And you really need to learn about how she got that trail name, by the way. She's an avid section hiker who could be said to be a touch obsessive about the Appalachian Trail. Like Curt today, Maria has an unwinding story that builds as she tells me about her adventures. You're really going to enjoy hearing from her. Earl Schaefer's Walking with Spring is up to the second part of Chapter 12. Earl is in the magnificent presidential range, and once more, reading it really brought those wonderful memories flooding back. Earl also gives us a lesson in Leave No Trace. Who'd have thought that his story would echo down the years and resonate so much with hikers today? I'll see you next week. In a state of collapse, the man in charge was relieved to learn that they were so close to Woolly House. The next day was remarkably beautiful. Billowy clouds in deep blue sky, perfect for hiking and photography. Unfortunately, my film supply was very low. After stopping at the post office for the letter, which had come as expected, I began a hectic effort to hitchhike to North Conway. No one would stop, probably because I didn't have my pack along. Then a car finally stopped. In it were two fashionably dressed young women, who seemed willing to let me ride despite my trail-worn appearance. They made room among the baggage on the back seat and took me aboard. The driver remarked, "Mama had misgivings about my touring the White Mountains until assured that no foolhardy hiking would be attempted." The other girl probably was her chaperone and companion. They insisted on stopping wherever film might be available, even at roadside stands until we reached North Conway, where some was available. And they waved and smiled as they travelled on. No kind-hearted damsels came from the opposite direction. Several hours passed before a man took me as far as Bartlett. I started walking after another hour there, even though the distance to the notch would have taken the rest of the day and all night. This changed my luck. A crew of road workers took me all the way to Woolly House. The sun was halfway down as I resumed the trek over Webster Cliff Trail. Once I spotted a spruce hen hiding among some stunted spruce, its natural colour making it difficult to see. Just before sunset, I rounded a knoll and saw a lean-to at the head of a long southerly ravine. Two movements caught my eye, one by the shelter, one by the spring. It was Bill and Craig Biddle, just arrived. Oddly enough, I'd been thinking about them that day, wondering if we would meet again. Bill said later that they were discussing the same thing. They said they wouldn't have wanted to meet anyone else, and the feeling was mutual. This was Mizpah Shelter, with a good Sweetwater spring and a long southern view, the most primitive and remote shelter along the trail in the White Mountains. We decided to celebrate by splurging on food. They had a can of peaches they had been hoarding for days, and some powdered soup. One of my contributions was pan bread. Bill watched me mix flour, oatmeal and cornmeal at random, toss in salt and baking powder, mix with water, then toss the mixture into the pan, well greased with margarine, and flip it over when it was done on one side. Bill watched in fascination and said I ought to call it Wonder Bread, because he wondered what it would taste like, and also whether it would land in the pan coming down. That's what it's been ever since. Best part is, it never tastes quite the same. The night was cold and windy, so I slept on the bough bed in the shelter. Bill and Craig had warm sleeping bags and preferred the outside. In the morning, we talked a while before leaving, once again in opposite directions. A white-throated sparrow was singing nearby, and Bill wrote years later that he always thought of Mizpah Shelter when he heard one. One thing is certain, we'll never see Mizpah again as it was then. That lean-to has been replaced by the most elaborate hut in the White Mountains. 17 years later, when southbound, I didn't even stop for a drink of water and turned on the wrong trail. The people were tourists, not hikers. From Mizpah, I crossed Mount Pleasant and Mount Franklin to the summit of Mount Monroe and a fine view of Mount Washington, highest peak in the northern Appalachians at 6,288 feet elevation. In the notch between was Lakes of the Clouds hut. The glacial ponds nearby are the highest in New England. Off to the right, in sharp contrast to moss and lichen-covered rocks, was two patches of snow, even though this was a sunny day in July. I turned aside for a close-up look and pictures. Lakes of the Clouds hut was being remodelled and enlarged, the materials brought in by backpackers. A few years later, it would have been helicopters. I talked briefly with the hut crew, then started for the summit, catching up with a man and his two small sons and slowing to walk with them. He said he was taking it easy, doubtful that the boys could make it. Half an hour later, they were scampering far in front and he was labouring hard. He wasn't that old, just out of shape, and the timberline was telling him so. The cog railway train had just arrived and several cars had come onto the toll road, so the summit was swarming with people. When the railroad was first proposed about 100 years earlier, the idea was ridiculed with an offer for a franchise to build a railroad to the moon. The toll road is almost as unbelievable and rough on vehicles, but most people will pay to ride rather than walk, even to the top of a mountain. A weather station has long been located on the summit of Washington. Wind velocities of several hundred miles an hour have been recorded, and midsummer snows have occurred, lasting as long as a week and dropping as much as 10 feet of snow. The extremes probably result from the high location between the warm Gulf Stream on the Atlantic and the Arctic reaches of Canada. Only Katahdin rivals and possibly surpasses Washington in weather extremes. The Appalachian Trail curves along the crest of the Presidential Range, always well above timberline, instead of taking the easier and shorter route down Tuckerman Ravine. Hikers were numerous. Once a group of college girls came along and I stepped aside. Most were too weary to notice anything except the rocks at their feet, but a few smiled shyly. Later, I overtook two young men from Minnesota, one of them tall, red-headed, and the most stumble-footed hiker I had ever seen. Perhaps it was his hobnailed boots. He sprawled repeatedly, but always managed to avoid breaking bones. The prospect of helping carry out a casualty didn't appeal to me, so I wasn't sorry when they turned off on a side trail. The sun was low as I crossed Mount Adams and came to Madison Springs hut, signed the register, and talked with the crew, telling them I would cross Madison before stopping. Outside the hut, Ward Hinkson of Chester, Pennsylvania, deliberately introduced himself and asked what I was doing. He was a long-time hiker who had climbed every important peak in the Adirondacks at least once and was now planning to climb them again with his sons. Ward was at Katahdin weeks later when my trip ended. Of special interest at Madison huts were the donkeys and burros stabled there. They were used to pack most of the supplies to the various huts. The wrangler said they were all right when you could get them to move. The army once tried to outdo them with army pack mules, but failed miserably. I had to suppress a pernicious notion to borrow one of the long-eared critters. The sun was setting as I scrambled over Madison, but light lingers long above timberline. Valleys already were in black shadow, and soundless twilight of the high country was deepening as I reached a spring in the first fringe of timber. My bed was a mat of spruce needles back of a rock. The trail was only a few feet away, but the average person would never have spotted me. When I left, the signs of my presence were so slight that the next rain would remove them. Like the Indians, I say, where I go, I leave no sign. 3 big and husky young men came striding soon after I started. One suggested, condescendingly, that carrying an axe really wasn't necessary. I didn't bother to tell him how far I'd come, but did mention that some parts of the Appalachian Trail were vastly different from New Hampshire. He shrugged indifferently, and the 3 strode nonchalantly on. It is for such as these that the warning signs are placed at timberline. Pinkham Notch Hut was headquarters for Joe Dodge, hut manager and mountaineer of vasty reputation. One of the crew took me to his office, mentioning on the way that you only need to get within 100 yards to meet Joe. This could be exaggeration, but the Paul Bunyan of the White Mountains did have a booming voice and a knack for storytelling. Many goofers have heard his tales of green-eyed comadabodies and such like monsters Joe had met in the wilds. His rescue efforts were legendary. He was the leader in developing the hut system in the White Mountains for the Appalachian Mountain Club. We talked for about an hour with footgear as a main topic. Joe favoured leather soles and corks, while my preference is for composition soles. Pinkham Notch Hut, unlike the others, is located near the highway in the Notch, with vacationers lounging about on porches and lawns. They took scant notice of the lone hiker passing on the way to the Wildcat Range. A mile or so beyond the highway was Lost Pond, with its series of beaver dams with water between. Each would slow the leakage in dry weather and lessen the pressure in time of flood, an incredible bit of animal engineering. To the south was Glen Ellis Falls, where water tumbles violently down a fissure in a cliff. The climb from Pinkham Notch was very steep on a series of shelves and ledges. Near the top, a man came headlong, slowing himself by grabbing bushes and trees. He stopped long enough to introduce himself as McKinney's, a chemist, and to assure me there was plenty of swamp water on the Wildcat. I learned afterward that this man was internationally known as a scientist and almost as well known for his mountaineering. The swamp water referred to was sometimes in rock basins and usually alive. From cliffs on Wildcat Mountain, an overlook shows the hut in Carter Notch directly below, near 2 small lakes, and the trail snakes down the cliff. The crewman on duty put the kettle on for tea while telling me his partner was due back with a packload. A few minutes later, a cracked-voiced yodel announced his arrival. He was big and husky, but staggering. He said, when able to talk, that he would never make 2 pack trips in one day again. They tried to give me supplies, but I had enough to reach Gorham and wanted to travel as lightly as possible. They said that Imp's shelter was a long way off and I might as well stay the night. I didn't dare show them the letter from the Greenleaf crew, or they never would have let me go. As it was, they cheerfully bid me, "Have a good trip," while stuffing chocolate bars and other goodies into my pack before I could escape. Imp's shelter was indeed far off, beyond Carter Dome, Middle Carter and North Carter. Cloud fog closed in like a snowy ocean, with high points for islands. When night came, I might as well have been blind. Somehow, probably because of my green eyes, I crept along, but didn't reach the shelter until midnight. I struck a match to view the interior and saw a porcupine disappearing through a hole in the floor. A chunk stove and bough-thatched bunk provided comparative comfort. The fog was gone in the morning, but a lack of destination signs caused me to miss Mount Surprise and reach the highway several miles south of Gorham. The trail, incidentally, now goes that way. No one in Gorham, not even the lady in the information booth, seemed to know anything about the trail. She did furnish a Forest Service map of the White Mountains and suggested the AT might cross the Androscoggin River at the Pow Dam north of town. The town of Gorham is famous for the fine silver handcrafted there in years gone by. Gorham was a mailing point, but this was Sunday and the post office was closed. The attendant at the power station was happy to have a visitor, said Callaway and Yambert had also stopped there. He mentioned a cold water spring a short distance up the trail, and I slept there. Mosquitoes were downright vicious, disregarding the 612 repellent I was using. On trips since then, I always carry a head net, the hooped kind, and consider it essential. At Pinkham Notch, I could have and should have gotten some Joe Dodge Special. It appeared to be the same formula used by Nessmuk many years before. It's wicked stuff, but bugs don't like it either. The formula: 1 ounce of pennyroyal oil, 2 ounces of castor oil, and 3 ounces of pine tar blended. Any bug that bites through that stuff has earned whatever he gets. In the morning, I picked up mail and finally had to ride a bus to Berlin to get colour film. A girl on a seat in front told a friend she was home on a visit from a job in a restaurant in Shenandoah National Park. The man at Dale's radio shop took a roll of film out of his own camera so I could have 2. Back in Gorham, I stocked up on food and got underway by early afternoon. Ahead was the Mahoosic Range, not high, but ranking as one of the toughest crossings on the entire AT, with plenty of ups and downs. Trident Shelter was shown on the map but had burned down. The next shelter was Gentian Pond, about 5 miles away. I practically ran through a region of swampy ponds, usually stained brown by rotting stumps and logs. Gentian Pond was one of the worst. Even the water in the brook was pretty rank. Otherwise, the place was fine. A brilliant moon rose majestically and the air turned misty cool. The fire burned low and my thoughts were long of places and miles behind me, the changing mountain structure, the meetings with hundreds of people, and always the giant hills.